The film begins in Oregon City, where we see a kid walking through the streets and running towards a pickup truck. As he sits inside it, his father comes along and asks him to stay inside the truck. Afterwards, he passes through a warehouse and enters a mine. He adorns a hazmat mask and, after lighting up a flare, walks inside and comes to a prepared workshop where his colleague is gathering stuff. Suddenly, they both hear strange noises in the mine, and as they follow it, they get attacked by something, and their shrieks ring throughout the mine. Outside, the kid hears the screams and slowly enters the mine, after which the screen blacks out. Next, we see a school teacher named Julia, who prepares herself and goes to class. She addresses the kids and gives them a lecture about storytelling. Except for one student, nobody else is willing to share any story. As a girl gets going with the story of Goldilocks, we see a timid young kid, Lucas, being bullied by another boy. As the class ends, Lucas walks outside and finds a monkey in his bag, while still being harassed and catcalled by the bullies. After school, Lucas strolls towards his house, and on the way, comes across a skunk along the water shore. He picks up a stone and is later seen returning home with a dead skunk. He enters his house to come along a closed door fastened with latches. Meanwhile, Julia is at the grocery store where she takes a longing look at the alcohol on the shelves, but then moves away from it. Upon returning home, she walks to the dust-covered piano and stands beside it. Just then, her brother Paul returns home and asks Julia how her day was at school. She briefly replies that it was okay, and then Paul goes away to rest for some time. Meanwhile, Julia takes some family pictures from the wall and puts them down. Lucas sits alone in his room and chops off the head of the stuffed monkey that the bullies gave him. Just then, the locked door in front of him starts rattling brutally with some strange noises behind it. Lucas sits stupefied and terrified. The following morning at breakfast, Julia and Paul argue a little bit as she states that she wants to move out, and Paul states that it's not possible. Afterwards, he leaves for his sheriff's duties, and Julia returns to the school where she asks the kids to come up with their stories. She urges Lucas to share his story, so he gets up hesitantly and shares the story of 3 bears, where the big bear loses his job and gets angry. As the middle bear returns home, both the bears are different. Lucas also has disturbing sketches in his sketchbook. Everyone listens to his story in complete silence, and the class ends. Afterwards, the rude boys get bullied themselves as one of them finds dog shit in his bag. He blames Lucas for it and ends up hitting him badly. Lucas gets taken to the nurse, where she checks him and sends him outside. In the meantime, Julia checks his student profile and calls Lucas's home. The phone rings and the camera pans through his house where a monstrous entity is struggling behind the locked door while the phone rings constantly. Since no one picked up the call, Julia leaves the school and starts following Lucas, who ends up outside an ice cream shop. Julia walks up to him and offers him to come inside, where they both sit together and eat ice cream. There, they start talking, and Julia asks him about his brother and mother. In reply, Lucas states that his brother's name is Aiden and that his mother is dead. Julia apologizes, and just as she asks him about his dad, Lucas gets up and leaves. Afterwards, he walks through his home, but on his way, passes through the woods and finds the carcass of a dead animal. He takes a while to stand there, then proceeds to pick it up. Julia drives to Lucas's house and slowly approaches the main door. After a knock, the door automatically opens, and just as she's about to enter, growling noises and dangerous commotion can be heard behind it. Immediately, Julia retreats and drives away. Later, at her own home, she puts together a ripped drawing by Lucas, and it turns out to be a demonic illustration. She stares at it in horror and suddenly gets jolted by Paul, who comes up behind her. She explains the trouble she's having, and the scene blacks out. Next, we see that Lucas is cutting up the meat from the dead animal. He packs it up and takes it to the closed room, where a contorting man comes ahead and snatches the food away. As the starving man lurks back into the dark, Aiden comes forward and grabs the food. Immediately after, Lucas closes the door and puts a latch on it. Later, Julia is playing the piano in her house when a man comes up behind her and begins to molest her. She struggles with breath, but is dismissed suddenly as Paul comes up behind her. She shrieks in terror and jumps up. Afterwards, she sits back and talks about how there's something wrong with Lucas's house, as his dad is Frank Weaver. Paul immediately states that she can't go looking and checking in other people's houses. In the interim, Lucas sits in his house and hears Aiden's screams behind the door, but he forcibly ignores them by putting on earphones. The following morning, Lucas sets up some traps in the forest when he suddenly finds a man named Warren, staring at another carcass in the trees. Meanwhile, Julie finds books about animal traps and dangerous spirits in Lucas's desk and takes them to the principal. She brings up his sketchbook and states that he needs help. The principal listens and states that she'll reach out to his father. Later, Julia leaves and goes to the grocery store. As she's walking outside, Paul comes to meet her and tells her that they found a man's body in the forest, completely dismantled in half. The camera pans back to Lucas's house where he's feeding his brother Aiden, who's bleeding through his eyes. Back in the corner, the kid's father is contorting and twisting himself in a hideous manner. Suddenly, Aiden starts to cough and spit out blood, and Lucas gets scared and runs away. Meanwhile, a coroner examines the disemboweled carcass of the dead body and gives a review that they found human teeth marks on the body. During this, the principal drives to Lucas's house and walks through the main door. Meanwhile, we see Lucas in the classroom carving out a buck's skull. As the principal enters the house, she walks to the locked door and opens it cautiously. With a slight fear, she goes upstairs where she finds Aiden sitting on the floor. In an abrupt manner, Frank attacks her with such monstrosity that she can't save herself. The beastly man ultimately rips off her arm and bites deeply in her neck, ultimately killing her. Afterwards, he starts contorting while his chest glows. Suddenly, he screams and his chest explodes to reveal spiked antlers. The next scene has police officers arrive at the mine to investigate. They enter and find several traps on the way. Paul communicates with his operators and asks for backup. Meanwhile, Lucas is walking home when his paths cross with the school bully. After the bully chases Lucas, both of them get apprehended by the monstrous beast. As Lucas runs away, the huge monster jumps on the kid and ravages him. Lucas returns home and finds the principal's car parked outside. Upon going inside, he finds the blood trails all over the floor and proceeds to clean them while adorning a mask. Meanwhile, Julia shares her suspicions with Paul, so he goes to Lucas's house. However, the kid is huddled up in a corner and doesn't open the door. The next morning, Julia notices his strange behavior and goes to his house later only to discover the missing principal's car. Later, the police arrive at the house and discover the corpses inside, who are hideously brutalized by some monster. Later that night, Lucas returns home, but Julia stops him and hugs him tightly. He's then taken to the hospital where the doctor evaluates his situation and considers him to have high psychological trauma. Julia insists on helping him. Later, Lucas lies in his bed and his mind reels through the past where both brothers witnessed their father's deteriorating situation. Their father locked himself in the room and ordered Lucas to keep the doors closed at all times. Gradually, his condition worsened and became more beastly. One day, he had pulled Aiden inside with him and closed the door. Julia and Paul take a drive and go to meet Warren Stokes. There, Julia puts up the sketches and speaks about Lucas. Warren stares at them for a while, then shares the story of Wendigo, a spirit that feeds on human flesh. He shares an old illustration from a book and refers the incidents to the smith. When they're driving away, Paul gets another call from his colleague Dan that there's been another killing. They arrive at the forest and witness the dead body of the kid. Despite this incident, Paul refuses to believe that there's something like a Wendigo. Julia gets exacerbated at his disbelieving behavior and asks him to go back to the hospital. They return and Julia takes Lucas into her care, so they eventually drive home. When they reach home, Paul puts Dan on the lookout. Meanwhile, Lucas and Julie talk with each other inside the house. Suddenly, they hear a loud growl outside, and Lucas states that he's here for him. Dan walks out to check the woods while Julia takes Lucas and hides behind a wall. Dan walks to a shed, and as he enters it, his torch falls on Aiden, who's curled up in a box. Just as he reports the situation to Paul, the Wendigo comes from behind and plunges its antlers inside Dan's body. The antlers pierce through his flesh, killing him. Elsewhere, Paul drives to the house and goes inside the shed where he gets attacked as well. The monster plunges its antlers in his arms and brutalizes him, but Paul manages to hit him with a spade and pushes him away. Julia watches this in sheer horror and she runs inside the shed to save her brother. After finding him, she patches him up and decides to take him to a hospital. During their trip, she makes a stop at the mine and decides to go inside. Slowly, she makes her way into the darkness until she discovers Lucas and Aiden inside the dark mine. Suddenly, horror runs down her spine as her torch shifts to a massive Wendigo feeding on a human body. It's revealed that Frank's skin has been peeled off, and underneath is a huge beast of terror. Frightened, Julia fires a few bullets at him, but it has no effect. After being hit, Julia lashes back with a rod this time. After multiple plunges into his glowing chest, she manages to slow down the monster, but the Wendigo still limps toward her. Suddenly, Lucas thrusts a knife into its back, and the monster crumbles to the ground. It starts whimpering, and Julia ultimately puts it to rest by stabbing it continuously until it dies. Afterwards, she gets up and hugs Lucas, but it turns out that similar symptoms are appearing in Aiden. His chest becomes illuminated and his breath ragged. Upon seeing it, Julia offers a solution, and despite Lucas's protests, She hugs Aiden closely and stabs him in the back while shedding tears and apologizing. In the final moments of the film, we see Paul and Julia in the beautiful scenery while Lucas is by the river. They take a smiling moment and Lucas returns. As Julia walks away from him though, Paul suddenly starts coughing. His breath becomes ragged and he spits out blood. With a horrified look on his face, the movie concludes. Thanks for watching, guys. Make sure to like and subscribe. See you next video.